Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty cool today.
Yeah.
A land use framework from South Africa's Northern Cape province. It's not just about zoning, it's like this big picture plan,
Yeah.
making sure the land can handle development, but stays healthy for a long time.
Yeah. It's actually called the Provincial Spatial Development Framework.
A PSDF.
Right, PSDF. And it's built on this idea of like planetary boundaries, kind of like a budget for the planet.
So we don't overspend, wreck the environment.
Exactly. Plus, they're using this thing called bioregional planning, which means they're looking at the unique strengths and vulnerabilities of different areas. A cookie-cutter approach just won't work.
Makes sense. So tailored to the Northern Cape?
Exactly. That's where those spatial planning categories come in, the SPCs. They've divided the Northern Cape into 6 different zones, each with its own approach.
Okay, I'm seeing the map in my head. 6 zones. So let's start with SPCA. What's that all about?
SPCA is all about protection, the core conservation areas. Like, think vast wilderness areas, tons of unique plants and animals, important habitats, even historical and cultural sites. They're strictly protected.
Basically creating those national parks and nature reserves to keep those places safe.
Right. Any development there has to be super low impact, like maybe ecotourism or research, let nature do its thing.
Makes sense. But what about the areas right around those core zones? Wouldn't development there still affect them?
That's where SPCB comes in, the buffer areas. They kind of surround the core zones like a shield,
Right.
minimizing impact.
So a transition zone.
Yeah, exactly. I think carefully managed agriculture, some ecotourism, things like that.
Okay, so we've got our protected areas and their buffers. But people need to eat. Where does farming fit into this?
SPCC agricultural areas, prime land for farming, especially along rivers and existing irrigation schemes. They want to keep that land strictly for agriculture.
To make sure the Northern Cape can feed itself in the future.
Yeah. And they're also pushing for more agri-processing, taking those raw agricultural products, like turning them into something more valuable.
Like turning fruit into jam or grapes into wine.
Exactly. Adds value, creates jobs, boosts the economy.
Okay, got it. We've covered protecting nature, managing farmland. What about the places where people live and work?
That's SPCD, the urban areas. The goal is to have really dense, efficient cities and towns, more focused on people, not cars.
So instead of suburbs sprawling everywhere, it's more about walkable neighborhoods, vibrant city centers?
Exactly. That kind of design tends to be more environmentally friendly. Less traffic, less pollution.
Right. Okay, so we've got protected nature, managed farms, and denser cities. What about the industries that drive everything? Where do they fit in?
SPCE industrial areas. Heavy and light industries both. But the focus is on responsible development. They want to make sure those industries aren't just polluting everything.
So balancing the need for jobs and economic growth with protecting the environment and people, too.
Yeah. The plan encourages industries that are more sustainable, like renewable energy, resource efficiency.
So part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Exactly. And lastly, we have SPCF, the infrastructure areas. This is where they plan out the transportation networks, utilities, pipelines, all that stuff.
Got to have that. But they're making sure it doesn't mess up the other zones, right?
Right. It all has to work together. Think about it. A new highway cutting through a protected area wouldn't make much sense. The PSDF is trying to make sure that all of those infrastructure projects are actually supporting the goals of the other zones.
So the PSDF lays out all these zones and their goals, but how do they actually enforce that? Like control what happens in each zone?
That's where things get even more interesting. The PSDF isn't just some document. It's actually woven into the legal and planning processes of the whole province.
So it's backed up by actual laws and regulations.
You got it. The PSDF guides stuff like zoning, environmental assessments, development approvals, and that's not all. They have another tool too, but we'll dive into that after a quick,
Wait, hold on. What's this other tool? Don't leave me hanging.
Haha. All right. You'll just have to stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive to find out. All right. No more cliffhangers. So remember how we talked about the PSDF influencing zoning, environmental assessments, and approvals? Well, there's another tool, the land use matrix.
Ooh, a matrix. That sounds pretty serious. What is that?
Think of it like a filter for what fits where, The matrix lays out all these specific activities, and for each zone, it'll say if that activity is encouraged, discouraged, or accommodated.
Okay, can you give me an example? How would it work in real life?
Let's say you want to build new houses.
Yeah.
The matrix would show that housing development is encouraged in those urban areas we talked about, SPCD. Makes sense, right? It's where people want to live.
Yeah, building homes in the middle of a protected wilderness area wouldn't really make sense.
Exactly. So housing would be discouraged in those core conservation areas, SPCA. But in the buffer areas, SPCB, it might be accommodated under certain conditions. Maybe some eco-friendly housing could be allowed as long as it meets like specific environmental standards.
Ah, so the matrix is like a set of guidelines to help make sure each zone is used in a way that aligns with the big picture.
Precisely. And it's not just about, top-down control either. One of the really interesting things about the PSDF is that it emphasizes community involvement.
So it's not just bureaucrats making decisions.
Not at all. They're bringing in local communities, traditional leaders, all sorts of stakeholders to be part of the planning process.
That's important. That's their land, their future.
Absolutely. Now remember those 6 spatial planning categories we talked about. Each one has these policy directives aimed at achieving those specific goals. Let's revisit those, starting with SPCA, those core conservation areas.
Yeah, remind me again, what's the main focus for managing those protected areas?
Well, for SPCA, the big thing is preserving those biodiversity hotspots, keeping those ecosystems healthy. So there are strict limitations on development, and the focus is on those activities that have minimal impact on the environment.
Ecotourism, research, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then in those buffer areas, SPCB, the focus shifts to minimizing the impact of human activities, making sure that urban sprawl doesn't encroach on those core areas.
Creating that transition zone, right? So what sorts of things are encouraged in those buffer areas?
Well, you might see things like sustainable agriculture, some ecotourism, carefully managed forestry. It's about finding that balance between human needs and protecting those ecosystems.
Okay, now what about those agricultural areas? SPCC. How do they plan to ensure sustainable food production?
So in SPCC, the priority is safeguarding that high potential agricultural land. They really want to encourage agri-processing too, adding value to those raw products.
So not just growing crops.
Right. Think wineries, fruit processing plants, even textile production from cotton, creating jobs, boosting the economy, but doing it sustainably.
Sounds good. Now on to the cities, SPCD, the urban areas. We were talking about density and efficient infrastructure. What kind of policies help create those vibrant urban centers they're aiming for?
Well, they really emphasize mixed-use development, so having those residential, commercial, and recreational spaces all integrated together. This makes it more walkable, reduces reliance on cars, builds a stronger sense of community.
Right, not just cramming people in.
Exactly. Plus, it helps contain that urban sprawl, which protects those agricultural and natural areas outside the city. Now, how about those industrial zones, SPCE?
I'm curious about that too. How do they make sure that industrial growth doesn't hurt the environment or the people who live nearby?
Well, every single industrial project in SPCE has to go through these really thorough environmental and social impact assessments. So they're considering any potential negative consequences and trying to, mitigate them.
Not just giving polluting industries a free pass.
Yeah, way. They're actively encouraging those industries that prioritize renewable energy, resource efficiency, green manufacturing, recycling facilities, that sort of thing.
A more circular economy.
Exactly. And then lastly, we have SPCF, the infrastructure areas, making sure those essential services support the broader goals.
Right. No highways through protected areas.
Exactly. And they're not just minimizing the negatives, they're pushing for infrastructure that actually contributes to sustainability.
Like renewable energy infrastructure or public transportation.
Exactly. Making those investments work towards the long-term vision. So all these pieces fit together. But it's not always easy, right? Putting this kind of ambitious plan into practice.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. What are some of the biggest challenges they're facing?
Well, first off, the Northern Cape is huge and diverse. We're talking deserts, valleys, cities, small towns. Trying to create a plan that works for everyone, everywhere. That's a real challenge.
Makes sense.
And, resources are always an issue. Implementing a plan like this takes a lot of funding, expertise, people to do the work.
It's one thing to have a plan, another to make it happen.
Exactly. And then there's always differing opinions,
You mean politics?
Let's just say not everyone is going to love every single aspect of this PSDF. There will be pressure from different groups to prioritize certain things.
So navigating that is a balancing act for sure.
Definitely. But even with all of that, the Northern Cape PSDF is a really great example of how a region can take a proactive approach. And they're thinking about the long term.
It's been a fascinating deep dive so far, but I know we've only scratched the surface.
That's true, but understanding these concepts is so important, especially now, with climate change, resource scarcity, all those pressures on our ecosystems.
So true. Well, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we have a question for you. How can we apply these ideas of sustainable development in our own communities and in our own lives even? Something to think about.
Absolutely. Remember, knowledge is power. Use what you've learned today to start those conversations. Let's work together to create a more sustainable future for everyone.
It really is inspiring seeing a region take this kind of big picture approach, you know. But let's step back a bit. What can the Northern Cape teach us about sustainable development, even for those of us not in South Africa?
That's a great point. The PSDF actually offers some pretty valuable lessons, I think. Lessons that could apply anywhere. For one thing, it shows how important it is to think holistically. We can't just focus on economic growth or environmental protection separately.
They're all connected.
Exactly. What we do in one area affects all the others. The PSDF also shows how important long-term thinking is. It's not just about putting out fires today, it's about anticipating those future challenges, having a plan that can adapt.
Especially with things like climate change, those long-term issues.
Right. And another big takeaway is that community engagement piece. You can't just force a plan on people.
It had to come from the ground up, too.
Absolutely. The PSDF shows that sustainable development is about more than just policies. It's about empowering people to take ownership.
I was also thinking about those challenges we talked about, the size of the region, the limited resources, the politics. Those are things that a lot of places are dealing with.
You're right. Those challenges are real. But the Northern Cape also shows that they can be overcome. It takes creativity, partnerships, and commitment.
It's good to see that progress is possible, even with all that complexity. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening for me.
Me too. But remember, knowledge is just the start. What we do with it, that's what matters.
So, to wrap things up, we encourage everyone to keep learning about these ideas. Look into what's happening in your own community. Start those conversations. Find ways to contribute to a more sustainable future.
It's a journey. Every step counts.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Northern Cape's journey towards sustainability. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.